Okay, so we have our XERO Pure MAX here, and we're going to talk about troubleshooting issues related with TDS. Now, TDS stands for Total Dissolved Solids, and that is the amount of stuff that's in your water. So when trying to diagnose and troubleshoot TDS issues, you want to make sure you have your TDS meter. Might look like this. I mean, it comes with each system, although there are many different brands. So your TDS meter, basically something that you are going to pour water in, and then it will tell you how many parts per million are in there. Now, generally, we say when your ppm is 10 and below, you're great for cleaning windows. If your TDS out of your system is higher than that, well, then there are some things we have to consider. First and foremost, we are going to start measuring the TDS coming out of our source water and see what this system is dealing with, first and foremost. So, we're gonna get a sample of our source water here. Okay, TDS is showing around 90, so 90 parts per million in this water. So now, I'm gonna run water into the system. Let the water start purifying. So first and foremost, you're gonna see water come out of your waste fitting. Wanna make sure that's happening. Remember, this is your concentrated salts, and all of that concentrate is getting rejected. And then your pure water will be coming out and feeding your resin chamber until we get some output here. Okay, so the Max here has 2 RO housings, so we can measure the pure of both ROs by this hose in the center. So we're gonna go ahead and measure to see how these ROs are performing. I've shut off the water because it's going to be a splash, so bear that in mind. That is back pressure. So now I'm going to open up this hose. Chances are I am going to get a little wet, but it's okay. Ooh, okay. Now we are gonna run water back into the system. So now at this point, this water here is the pure water output of both RO housings. So this is telling me the water is purified from both. So it's a mixture of two. We got good flow here. Let's see what our pressure is. Okay, our pressure is around 65 right now. 65 PSI. So now, let's run water into our TDS meter and measure the output. Okay, so from our 90 TDS into the system, from both RO housings, the pure got it down to 8 ppm. So generally, you want to see these membranes performing above 80% rejection. These will perform about 95 to 99% rejection under the best conditions. However, when that rejection gets down to around 80%, so we had 8 ppm now, say from that 90, we only got 50 out of the system. Well, right now that's telling us, okay, these ROs aren't doing what they're supposed to. That could be a problem. On the Max, we have 2 ROs here. While it's less than likely, it could be that the issue is through 1 RO tank. So how do we determine that? Well, I'm gonna re-hook up our DI here, and then I'm gonna show you at the bottom of the system here. If you can see that. At the bottom of the system here, you have your T-union. And this hose here splits both RO housings into one, or rather, this hose joins the pure water of both RO housings into one. So if you separate one end, it might be a little tricky. You're gonna pull on the blue end of the push fit and pull on the opposite end of the hose. It's a little awkward. Okay, so now that we have these hoses disconnected, we are currently looking at, this will be your left. So if you're looking at it, you're seeing the left RO here and the right RO here. So now when we run water through, we can measure each of the outputs. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we got a bucket to catch some spillage here. I'm gonna go ahead and run water into the system now. So if you can see that, we have 2 different outputs here. Pure water of 1 RO housing and the pure water of the other RO housing. So we're gonna check this guy first. Collect that sample. Sample. There we go. So RO1 has it down to 17. RO2 has it down to 14. That's an interesting result. There we go. You may notice that when you first run water into your system, that your TDS is always going to be a little higher. I should point that out. Your initial reading is going to be a little higher. Why is that? Because you have stopped solids in your filters. So those are the first things to come out. So you run it for a little bit. My result was 17 at first. However, after getting some appropriate flow, TDS went down to 4 ppm out of this RO. I'm just gonna get this trickle and also 4. So there was a little spike at first. You wanna make sure you run it for at least 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. Just let that purification start. Then you can get more of an accurate reading on how this is performing. So that being said, we were getting 4 and 4 out of both of these ROs from that 90 TDS. So that's a really good rejection rate at that point. Now say we went to test, we tested both ROs and we got 50 TDS out of this from that 90. Okay, so our ROs are not performing the way they should. First of all, verify that you're getting enough flow into your system. You're using the right hose size. Is it 5/8 inch minimum inner diameter? Is it a 3/4 inch? Or are you using 3/8? 3/8 is not going to be enough to supply your water to your system to properly purify as well. You're going to have flow issues and probably some TDS. So bear that in mind. You want to make sure that your source is helping your filters perform the way they should. Say your source is great, you have great flow, and your TDS is bad. Okay. So you start with the joined ROs, check that TDS, then you check both of the individuals. If this one stayed 4, but this one is like 60, well, right there that tells you this RO for some reason is not performing properly. Perhaps this RO has some growth in there that hasn't quite affected this housing yet. Maybe some sort of debris has gotten in here that is affecting both flow and purification. Perhaps the system itself has frozen and you have damage to one membrane but not the other. How is that possible, you may ask? Well, while conducting an experiment with water bottles exposed to outdoor temperatures, I found through cold, and I'm talking freezing cold temperatures, under 30 degrees, up to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. I had one bottle filled to the brim with water and another bottle with significantly less water. Which bottle froze? It was the bottle that was mostly full, solid, while the smaller bottle stayed liquid. Now, how is that possible in 0 degree temperature exposed to the air? Well, the container that has more water will freeze first. So if you have a system and you're storing it in your van and you had a freezing spell, you test your ROs, and for some reason this RO's working, this RO's being funky, it's not purifying right, it's not flowing right. Perhaps this RO froze and this one didn't. There's so many unknowns when it comes to freezing systems. So that's why I advise, do not freeze your system. You will damage your filters, you will damage your flow, you will damage your purification. You'll damage your sanity. So at this point, make sure you're taking care of your system. If you're gonna store it for a couple weeks, use your RO Guardian. Prevent any microbial growth, because as this is your most expensive filter, you want to take care of it. And if it's not purifying properly, well, you have to understand everything you need to do to make sure it's always purifying properly. Keeping up with your carbon filter changes, making sure it doesn't freeze, making sure you're maintaining the sit-down period. All of those things are factors that you must consider in your membrane health. So now that we talked all about the membranes and we understand what kind of purification we're kind of expecting from the RO housings, let's go back to our original reading. 90 TDS coming out of the sink. We have around 8 TDS coming out of both of the RO housings. So we have a proper rejection, and now your DI resin is going to polish off that little bit of TDS. They're cleaning windows. You want to have spot-free cleaning. On the subject of ROs, while they're really good at taking things out of your water, there are some things that ROs do not like and that will damage them. And I'm talking about chloramines. Now, chlorine, it's a chlorine-based chemical used to treat water. And it's used a lot in municipal waters, city water. And RO membranes do not like chloramines. Chloramines causes burning. We call it burning, scarring. Burning through the membranes. Literally gonna burn holes in there. It's a chemical that this is not meant to handle. So that being said, if you're running water with chloramine into your membranes, eventually it's just gonna burn out too fast and you are going to have TDS issues that are unexpected. You know, your membrane's supposed to last you a year if you take care of it, but say it's been 6 months and you've been keeping up with your carbon filter changes. You may not have the harshest water. You may not be in Arizona. At that point, research what kind of water you're dealing with in your area. Check to see if chloramines are used to treat the water. Because then at that point, we've always said that your carbon filter is your first step of defense for your membranes. Well, at that point, you want to protect them from chloramines. You might want to opt in for a chloramine filter for your pre-filter as opposed to a carbon filter. In general, that'll protect your membranes anyway. So I highly recommend that because you never know what you're dealing with. So that being said, do not neglect. That being said, if you are using a lot of city water, consider using a chloramine filter to maximize the life of your membranes. I'm going to talk about the final step of filtration here, which is your resin chamber. Now, as I've mentioned, your resin chamber, it's a 10-inch cartridge that your system comes with a filled cartridge filled by us, set in place and ready to go. Now, I should mention that 9 times out of 10, a resin issue occurs post-resin change or when it's time for a change. Now, how does that make sense? Your resin is gonna be your indicator that your system is ready for maintenance. Once you hit 10 ppm, it's time for filter changes, right? It's time for a resin change. At that point, your resin beads have expired their ability to move charged ions. So at that point, you're not really getting purification the way you want it. So you see your system hit above 10 ppm, it's time to change that resin chamber. Now, I mentioned before that like 9 times out of 10, the resin issue happens post-resin change. Now, why is that? There are some things that can easily get overlooked when it comes to changing resin. Now, I mentioned the system comes with a resin chamber filled by us. Those chambers are for sale. You can buy a pre-filled cartridge to replace your resin, and at that point, you just take your brand new cartridge, add a little lubrication, seat it properly in your housing, and you're good to go. However, we also offer individual cubes of resin that you can buy and refill your cartridge yourself. So bear in mind, when you are refilling a cartridge yourself, you want to make sure you're doing it the right way. First and foremost, you want to make sure you're putting enough resin in here. Now, this is a cartridge that I've taken from a system that was having issues. If you can hear that, media is moving around inside. That's not good. You never want to hear your media shaking and rattling around in there, because that's telling you there's not enough resin in there. We'll open this up just so you can see what's going on in here. This cartridge would definitely not purify the way it should. You see this donut here? This donut is intended to sit inside this cap. Now, a common mistake people make is they will refill their resin. They'll fill it up to a point like this, and then they'll say, okay, time to close it up. Let's go. Then they close up, put it in, and for some reason, out of my resin chamber, I'm getting 15 TDS. There's something wrong with the system. No. At that point, your cartridge is not functioning the way it should. Water needs to travel and touch all these beads in a clear and even fashion. Right now, you're already having a separation of space. At that point, you have too much space in this resin container. Your foam filter here, which is also supposed to stop any of those debris, because these are beads, that filter has to be here. That way, you're not getting any excess beads that may show up as parts per million in your water. So remember, ppm isn't saying, oh, germ number 1, germ number 2 is coming through. It's saying, hey, there's stuff in here. So you want to bear in mind that if you're refilling your cartridge, that you're putting everything back the way it should, and that your cartridge is properly filled. We're going to compare these two cartridges here. See how I opened this cartridge and the donut stayed where it should? We know our connection was good. And I'm going to compare here. Look at the resin level in here. I mean, this is a little dry resin, but it's very low. you would get a bad purification result out of this. In here, we have a tightly packed, a little moist resin chamber. I always advised that when you fill this, that you pack it in real tight, smack the cartridge down on the table, and make sure that your resin level is at least touching the first 2 threads. That way you know it's pretty compact in there. And at that point, you should have no problem in putting your donut into your cap and sealing the connection. Also at the same token, as I always say, after any sort of maintenance to these housings, you want to make sure your connections are good afterwards. So lubricate your seals. Take your magic lube that came with your system, and lubricate your seals. Lubricate your O-rings. You have an O-ring here, and you also have an O-ring on your system here. You also have an O-ring on your housing here. This helps secure the connection to the cap. So make sure you lubricate both. Take your time. You want to make sure that you're doing this right so you don't confuse the issue with something else that may be happening. So again, as a reminder, about 90% of TDS issues are just a filter that needs changing. And at that point, we're figuring out what. So by keeping up with your carbon filter changes, keeping up with what kind of pre-filtration you'll need to help protect these membranes, as well as keeping an eye on the performance of the housings to make sure purification is proper, make sure you got waste flow. Make sure you have waste flow. Make sure your connections are the way they should. Same thing with your resin container, as I always say. If you're filling it yourself, make sure it's filled properly. Make sure you lubricate your seals. Make sure it's properly placed in the housing where it's not crooked. And take your time spinning the housing back onto the cap. That way it's making a good connection. You don't have to worry about how well it's purifying. So again, trace the plumbing to your system. Follow the numbers of TDS. Remember, your ROs are going to reject up to 95 to 99% of those solids that are coming in. And when it's about 80%, it's definitely time for a change. You take care of your membranes, you'll get a good year out of them, maybe a little more, but at that point, it's totally at the mercy of you. At the end of the day, understanding your water will better help you to understand your system. So when you're troubleshooting, take your time with it. Think about every single possibility. There are hundreds of things that could affect water. So by understanding the basics of your system will go a long way in understanding how to maintain your system for its lifespan. That caps it off with TDS issues. Remember, if you run into any issues on the field, we have product specialists that'll help you to diagnose the issue. That being said, I'm Brandon, XERO Products.